Hey, greetings and welcome to this is the April 1st first lecture. We are halfway through this week, and I hope you've had a great week. Sorry for the late uploads. I have built, I think, a pretty helpful PowerPoint. That's what took me all day to build that. And so I wanted to make sure that was up there for you. I think it's going to be really helpful as we move towards our exegesis. So if you will go to your module, you can look up Bib Herm PowerPoint number 3. It's there. All the slides are there, or you can actually download that, and there's a few hyperlinks that if you download it, you'll be able to access through the download. You won't get those from the JPEGs that are up there on the actual module, but if you download it, you'll be able to hit those hyperlinks along the way. All right, so we have been setting up for this week a deeper dive, a deeper look into the three worlds of the text, the world behind the text, the world of the text, and the world in front of the text. And we sort of left off by looking at the history of interpretation, how we arrived to where we are in even terms of the conversation we're having about those three worlds. Again, reminding that the assumption was that the world could be that the word could be taken as it was, as the word of God, valued through the teaching of the church, or the plain sense as understood in relationship to Jesus through the Reformation. But as we enter into modernity and into the Enlightenment, there is a sort of a challenge to the credibility to the text, or how do we make sense of the text in this new world? So those are the kind of questions that we're going to seek to answer through this. But as we investigate, as we step into, as we begin to analyze this world behind the text, I wanted to start off with a slide there. It's the second slide in this, and because I remember that many of you talked about how when you started reading the scriptures, you just sort of took it as it was, like at face value. It just was what it said, and you didn't always grasp or understand the deeper, textured, rich history behind these texts. The world that would come alive when you understood like what was happening in those days, or where it was, or the political, economic, social, cultural conditions of those times, and how the deeper dive that you take into that, the more the scriptures come alive. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about the world behind the text, is trying to understand the world that gives rise to that text in the first place, so that it, in a sense, comes to life. And that's what we're going to talk about. So, did you know, that's where I want to start, did you know that when Jesus was preaching and teaching, he was primarily addressing four different groups of religious folks within Jewish culture during his day? There's the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which we're often accustomed to seeing in the Gospels. Each of those had perspectives, both religious perspectives and political perspectives in terms of the relationship with Rome. But then there's also the Essenes and the Zealots. And it's interesting that each one of these different groups had different feelings about the other group, and Jesus is somehow navigating and traversing the terrain, addressing each one. Interestingly, Jesus recruits from one of these groups to his ministry, one of these ragamuffins that he's going to eventually come to call the apostles, is from the group of the Zealots. And the Zealots would have been considered in our day as like terrorists. They were adamantly opposed as to any sort of concession that the Jews should give to Rome. Any occupation of Rome was seen as a threat to the Jewish identity, and to the Jewish land, and any conspirer was considered to be an enemy of the Jewish people. And so Jesus recruits one of those zealots, one of those terrorists. But then get this, not only that, he also recruits a conspirer, a tax collector by the name of Matthew. Now this zealot would have had very harsh feelings towards someone like Matthew. And Jesus thinks it's a great idea to put them in the same gaggle. So we need to understand that even within the disciples themselves, we might find that there's the setup for conflict. It might give us a way of trying to understand who these leaders were. Did you know that even within Peter and Andrew and James and John, both of them being fishermen, the language that is used for nets in the Greek is different between the two of them, signifying that one group was probably richer than the other group, and which maybe even help us understand why James and John thought that they should sit at the right hand or the left hand of Jesus. So we need to understand there's some really cool cultural history back in these stories. Did you know that in Paul's speech in the Areopagus in Acts chapter 17, when he's addressing the people in Athens, did you know that Paul is proclaiming the gospel on the fly in light of the language that the philosophies of the day would have used, the Stoics and the Epicureans. Did you know that his preaching of the gospel is speaking directly to those philosophical systems of the day? Did you know that that was at work in the way in which he speaks in the Areopagus? Did you know that Moses probably didn't write all the first 5 books of the Bible? I know some of us have been trained to hear that, and we've talked a little bit about that in class, but did you know that there's probably multiple sources contributing to the arrangement that we now come to call those first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and that within there there's certain traditions that have contributed to the composition as a whole, and in that composition as a whole, we come to discover great meaning, but we also find meaning as we break those out into the various sources that probably contributed to the writing of the Torah. Did you know that the book of Daniel probably wasn't written around Babylon at all? In fact, it was probably written around 2nd century BC, as the Jews found themselves under the oppression of another group of people called the Seleucid Empire, and that probably that book would have been written in reference to their need to somehow remain true or remain faithful in their observance of their worship of Yahweh and stay true to their story in the face of this oppressive empire and regime. Did you know that apocalyptic literature was often used as a specific form of literature, the kind of book, the kind of literature that we find at the end of Daniel or in Revelation, as a sort of subversive communication by certain groups of people, that they could talk about certain things sort of in this in-crowd, that we shared this inner language that maybe the others, the occupying force, wouldn't have understood. It's a sort of subversive language. So how would you read the second part of Daniel or Revelation if you knew that they're engaging in some subversive action by the way in which they communicate in those passages? And did you know that there's probably 3 Isaiahs in that one book that we call Isaiah? There's probably an Isaiah chapter 1, an Isaiah 1 who is the one we believe to be the original Isaiah, and then somebody from the school of Isaiah that contributes chapters 40 to probably 55 or so, and then a third Isaiah probably that contributes after that. And so the book of Isaiah covers a broader historical setting than would have been possible for one author, but all of them sort of encompass the message and the history and the legacy of Isaiah through his students. All of these are just historical and cultural and political and religious pieces that are part of the history behind the text that I think adds value. I think it adds meaning. I think it adds fullness and richness and texture to our understanding of the text. So as we talk about the world behind the text, I want us to understand that we're engaged in an endeavor to try to add the richness to the activities that we are trying to understand what this text means. If you continue down your PowerPoint there, we'll make our way to the next set of slides. Again, we're dealing with the 3 worlds of the text. You can see that slide there. That slide's going to be used consistently over the next few weeks. But then I want to speak specifically to the world behind the text and remind us that as we enter into this conversation of the world behind the text, that we are dealing with a rupture of ecclesial mediation, meaning this. It was once that the text came to us through the clergy, and that what the magisterium taught was to be considered as truth. And in many ways, you didn't question the authority of the text or its truthfulness. But in the Enlightenment, there's that rupture with that ecclesial authority. And reason is given that preeminence, right? That prominence. The individual now becomes the arbiter of truth, not dependent upon this some sort of churchly institution. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that as we make our way through this understanding of the world behind the text. For some, there was an attempt to study the text simply as literature, right? From a humanistic point of view, a secular point of view, to understand it as a text. And then for some, they're studying the text and the world behind it so that it can have greater impact and meaning in the world in which we find ourselves. It's really about taking seriously the historic context. No matter how you approach it, it's really about taking seriously the historic context out of which the text comes. And if we can understand what it meant, then we can understand what it means. And there's a couple names here at the bottom of the slide, and I'm not going to get into it too far with you, but Friedrich Schleiermacher is considered to be the father of what we call modern hermeneutics. And his understanding was, in order to understand what a text means, you have to understand basically the author, who the author was, how the author thought. And if you could reconstruct the psyche of the author, then you could somehow get to the true text's meaning. He gives birth to a number of philosophers who will take this in a number of different directions, this idea of hermeneutics, but then they'll see exegetical rules develop through the person like Dilthey. And so what I want to just say to you is that there's a history here. There's philosophers that were speaking about how do we most faithfully engage the text. So a couple of things I want you to keep in mind for this lecture is, number one, did you know the stuff that lays behind the text is good stuff that adds to the richness and the fullness of the text? It makes the text come alive, and it's exciting, and it makes it come alive to our people. That this world behind the text is a part of this rupture of ecclesial mediation. No longer are we just assuming the text is true because the clergy tells us true or because it is the Word of God. Now it's sort of under scrutiny. Some want to scrutinize it to see if it's worth holding on to. Some folks scrutinize it to really kind of bring out from behind the text the world and help it to have greater additional impact in the world in which we find ourselves. So those are the main key issues that I want you to keep in mind as we navigate the world behind the text as we move into the second lecture.